Okay, so I think we're ready to begin. Good morning to those in South Africa. Good evening to those joining from Australia, in particular from Melbourne. It really gives me such pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. In fact, for the next 2 Sundays to follow, Bev Sacho, thank you so much for graciously giving of your time. I must just say that it was Wendy Roth, who's the secretary of our shul, of Emerentia Shul, who told me about you and that she'd been connecting and how fascinating she'd found your talk. So she said, I have to absolutely be in touch with you, which I was. And obviously it was just about scheduling, finding a time as soon as possible after Yom Tov, after the Chagim had passed. And thank God we're here. And as I'm mentioning, Wendy, she should please God have a refuah shalema. She should have a complete and speedy recovery. So just a very, very short bio, an introduction to our speaker, to Bev, who is ex-South African as well, like so many living in Melbourne today. So developing an avid interest in Jewish history at a young age, Bev has been both a student and a teacher of Jewish history informally for the last 25 years. She has an interest in medieval Jewish history with a focus on the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. When Bev is not studying history and when she's not so graciously giving of her time to teach students, us thousands of kilometers away, the other side of the world, she's a busy optometrist running a practice together with her husband, as well as being a mom to 4 children. Her undergraduate studies are in psychology and optometry, with postgraduate studies in eye disease and medication, as well as pediatric optometry. She has also volunteered as a guide at the Holocaust Museum in Melbourne for the last 8 years. I really don't want to keep you much longer. I just want to hand over now to Bev. And again, once again, Bev, thank you so much for giving of your time. And we're all eagerly anticipating this wonderful talk. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking here tonight. I'm going to do this talk in honor of Wendy. That she should have a quick and speedy refuah, and yeah, because of her that I am talking to you tonight. I have done a talk very, very similar to this in Melbourne, and I've done a few talks in Melbourne. So if you enjoy this one, I'm more than happy to continue to do some more talks for you. As you can hear from my accent, I am ex-South African. I've been away first in New Zealand for 11 and a half years, and then in Melbourne. So for 27 years, I've been out of South Africa, but I still have very much a South African accent. And I guess that's because of all the hundreds of and thousands of South Africans that are actually in Australia. So I get to keep up my South African accent a lot.
Hi. I see Emerentia Shul in the background. I was a member there from.
Hi, Lily. I think everybody's muted. So yeah, so I'm going to get straight onto the talk, but it's lovely to see. It's lovely to see you all there. So tonight we're going to be talking about the history of Ashkenazi Jewry. Now, I guess I'm talking to a majority South African audience, and some of us in Melbourne that may or may not be South African, but many of us know that our family history is coming from either Lithuania or from Poland or from Germany or from England, and the majority of us would call ourselves Ashkenazi Jews. So tonight I'm going to go way back. We're going to be talking about medieval Ashkenaz tonight, and then we'll go right throughout history until today, and over the next few weeks. So it will be lovely to have you with me over those few weeks. But tonight, really, we're doing medieval history, and medieval history is my pet love, and so I'm very happy to be talking about this with you tonight. So we know that a lot of us are Ashkenazi. How many Jews are in the world today? Around about 15 million. How many Jews are Ashkenazi? So around about 10 million. So 5 million are not Ashkenazi. That's a very small amount. So the majority of us are Ashkenazi. Where did we come from initially? So there's many different theories, and if you trail the net, you'll find lots and lots and lots of different things about where Ashkenazi Jews come from. But initially, we have to say that we all came from the land of Israel. And then after the destruction of the temple, and even a little bit before the destruction of the temple, Rome was the dominant empire in the country at the time. Goodness me, sorry. My son is phoning me. Rome was the dominant, Rome was the empire at the time when the temple was destroyed. And so the Roman Empire basically was where Jews were then moved to once the temple was destroyed. And even a little bit before the temple was destroyed, Jews were already moving out into the wider parts of the empire. So Jews were moving north with the Romans. They moved into sorry, I'm going to can everybody hear me? I guess that's a question. That is all right. So I'm just wondering if maybe my kids are phoning me to tell me that they can't hear me. All right. So basically, there were Jews. I'm just going to take my phone out. Then I can talk better. Right. Basically, okay, so moving north with the Romans once the temple had then been destroyed, and Jews moved northwards into Italy, and then from Italy then into the lands of Gaul, which is France, and into Germany. So Germany, basically, when we talk about that we are Ashkenazi Jews and from the medieval lands of Ashkenaz, Ashkenaz basically was Germany. So Germany and parts of France. So that is actually where where our roots really originate from. I'm just going to share the screen here. So if you look at this map, you can see that that blue area on top there is where Ashkenazi Jews come from. And you'll see France and Germany and Russia and Lithuania and Poland, and everything's all in there. And then the red areas are Sephardi Jews, so Jews that have come from Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, and then where they've moved after the expulsion from Spain. The green is Mizrahi Jews, so Jews that are coming from North Africa, but also coming from the Middle East, all the way through to Iran, Iraq, those areas. And then of course we've got that yellow, which is other Jews coming from India and Jews coming from China and from Ethiopia. So basically Ashkenaz, as I've told you, Ashkenaz was medieval Germany and parts of France, and that is really where we come from. Now, when the Jews moved with the Romans into these areas of Gaul and parts of Germany, the Romans were actually not, life for Jews was actually quite pleasant. It was certainly not nothing like it became once Christianity became the dominant religion of the time. So, you know, Jews were traders in general, and they didn't have a bad time. Once Christianity became dominant in the Roman Empire, and then the Roman Empire fell, life became very, very difficult for Jews living in the area that we know as Ashkenaz. And so there was just a small amount of Jewish communities. There was very difficult. There was a lot of anti-Jewish rhetoric. The church was just establishing, and as it was just establishing, it made life for Jews very, very, very hard. But then basically you have the Muslims invading Spain in the year 711. And once they come into Spain, the Roman, well, what was now the Christian Empire in France, in Germany, and sort of Central Europe felt very, very hemmed in by Islam, because Islam had just expanded so quickly. And so you land up with a with Christians who don't want Jews to be there, but in actual fact, Jews are the ones that are keeping the economy of their sort of those lands going, because the Jews can communicate with each other. So you've got Jews talking to each other in Spanish lands, in Arab lands, and in other parts of Europe. And because of the sort of network that you have between Jews, Jews were good with commerce. And even though the early Christian church was very vehemently anti-Jewish, they the kings and the nobles actually needed the Jews. So you get this like indispensable but despised Jew very early on. The Muslim expansion was then stopped by Charles Martel, and he was from the Carolingian dynasty, and that happened in 732, and that's when the Arab expansion or Muslim expansion into Europe stopped. So we've got the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, we've got sort of Muslims North Africa, and then we've got this whole sort of chunk in the middle, which then becomes called Holy Roman Empire, and that is under the great Charlemagne. And Charlemagne starts this Holy Roman Empire, which you should know was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but it was called the Holy Roman Empire, confused with the Roman Empire, which was actually that fell in the mid 400s. So now we're talking Holy Roman Empire, and of course the Holy Roman Emperor was actually very pro starting the economy and building up his lands, and so he actually invited Jews to come into his lands and come and establish themselves in communities. And this is really when traditional Ashkenaz really starts. Yes, so lands become the land actually became quite good for Jews. Jews established themselves around the Rhine in towns that we know of we call them Shum. So it's Speyer, Worms, and Mainz in Yiddish, or Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. Those are really the towns in the Rhineland where the Jews managed to establish themselves and started yeshivas. The communities became very strong in those areas. There, in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, there were about 20,000 Jews already living there, and they started to come from everywhere. So Babylonia was in decline in the 800s. The yeshivas of Babylonia, Sura and Comedisa were already in decline, and so Jews started to move across and follow where commerce was going and where Jewish communities were being well established. And so they moved from Babylonia, they moved from Asia Minor, they moved from the Balkans, they moved from Italy, all into these traditional lands of Ashkenaz. And they established a language, Yiddish. So initially Yiddish was just sort of a trading language, so they'd be able to speak to each other. But gradually Yiddish established itself as a proper language, and that was the language that everyone in those areas spoke. When we know Yiddish today, there's very different forms of Yiddish from the East and from the West, but Yiddish was a developing language at this stage. So it was combining, bits of Hebrew, bits of Aramaic, bits of early German in there, and there's also Slavic as well, because of course Jews had come from all different lands. Okay, so just to show you over here, just a very quick picture of where the Ashkenazim are. You can see there in Central Europe. There were many expulsions, which we'll talk about later. So you can see Jews coming in. I don't know if you can see my pointer, I'm not sure, but Jews are coming really in these blue arrows. They're coming in from the Mediterranean. They're coming into the lands of Ashkenaz. And then also, after the Spanish expulsions, after the English expulsion in 1290, they're coming into the lands of Ashkenaz. And then, of course, there were many expulsions from the lands of Ashkenaz, and that's how we landed up in the east. That's how we landed up in Poland, and that's how we landed up in Lithuania too. So let's have a look over here where the lands of Ashkenaz were. You can see we've got Speyer, Worms, and Mainz here, so that's Shum. And then there's other places there, you'll recognize those names. They're still around in Germany today. Like Cologne is still there. They're all these towns are still here. But Marseille and Avignon, that is, France, but that is still lands of Ashkenaz. So it's really mostly Germany, but also France. You can see when those communities were established. So really around about the late 800s, people start coming, 900s, thousands. Once the year 1000 comes along, that's when the yeshivas really start establishing, and that's when the communities really come on force to, especially to the Rhineland. That becomes a very, very popular destination, and also France, the Rhone Valley in France. Okay, now let's talk about life in Christian Europe. So basically, life in Spain was kind of different to life in Christian Europe. In Spain, it was warm. The Muslims were very, it was much easier for Jews living under Muslim rule in Spain. But living in Christian Europe, we're living in a, in a very dark, repressive, and violent society. Lots of superstitions. It was a religiously fanatical society, and it was, of course, governed by the feudal system. So if you have a look over here at this picture that I've got of the feudal system on my screen, you can see that at the bottom you've got peasants, and then knights, and then nobles, and right up at the top you've got the king. But do you see Jews anywhere in this feudal system? No, because they weren't there. And that was a lot of the problem for Jews living in the Middle Ages, is they just didn't fit into the feudal system. So of course, it wasn't pleasant being a peasant, but you had the support and the protection of the nobles on whose land you worked. And of course, you all fell under the king. So each one, even though you might be down at the bottom, you still have protection from the one above. And it was in their interest to keep you protected, because they needed you to farm the land or whatever you were doing for the nobles. But unfortunately for Jews, because they fell out of this feudal system, there was no protection for them. Basically, Jews were the chattels of the king. So the Jews belonged to the king, but they had the protection of the king. But the king is like not around in towns and villages. The king is like a figurehead right up at the top. So if you need protection from the king, you're probably not going to get it. You need protection from the nobles, but you don't fall under the nobles. And sometimes you're in competition to the nobles, because Jews were still running commerce even in the Middle Ages. And so the king needed Jews really for commerce. Jews were very restricted in what they were allowed to do. They weren't allowed to farm land. They weren't allowed to have trades and professions that many that Christians had. Jews were very restricted. One of the things that they were allowed to do was money lending. And so Jews became very good at money lending, because that was one of the professions that was allowed to them. And not because they necessarily chose that. But as I said before, because Jews had connections and could speak to Jews in other places, it just meant that commerce and sort of, merchants were quite common within the Jewish population, compared to like if you were a serf and you were born on the land, you tended to live in that land and not go anywhere. So Jews were kind of mobile, much more mobile. Unfortunately, they were sometimes mobile because they were expelled. And they had to move, but in general, Jews were mobile and were merchants, a merchant class, but chattels of the king. That also means that if the king doesn't like you, or if the king owes too much money to you, they can decide to get rid of you. And so oftentimes, when Jews were owed a lot of money, or the Jewish community was owed a lot of money, the king would just decide, or the prince, or whoever place you lived in, would decide to expel the Jews from that land. At some stage, we had 3 expulsions in 100 years from France, and it was money. But then when they ran out of money, they get the Jews back in. So general society was ignorant. There was no idea of sanitation. Medieval man sort of spent his time in a drunken haze, because of course you couldn't drink the water, and so people were sort of living on mead and on wine. And yeah, if you're spending your time in a drunken haze, unfortunately, you're going to make some crazy decisions, and that is really what happened in the Middle Ages. So Jews were always urban. They tended to live in towns where it was possible, and so the Kehillah, the idea of the Kehillah was born. Jews sort of living together, depending on each other, and it was also safer for Jews to live in a community than it was to live sort of scattered around in rural areas. So once Jews were living in a community, you get the idea of the Kehillah developing, and Ashkenaz was full of many Kehillot. You can see over here in this picture, I'll just show you briefly. We will talk about medieval anti-Semitism fairly soon, but we've got a picture here of synagogue and ecclesia. Ecclesia is this image over here that's representing the Christian church, and synagogue is this figure who looks very downtrodden. She is blindfolded because of course she's blind to the truth of Christianity, and this is how Judaism was really represented. Ecclesia is sort of represented as a queen, or so the church was shown to the population to be high up and elevated and loved, and Jews were shown to be downtrodden and sort of blinded to the truths of the new religion. And this is how the population saw Jews, because this is the information they were fed. You can have a look in this picture over here, where you can see Jews are wearing traditional Jewish clothing. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Jews were forced to wear specific clothes to keep them separate from the rest of the community, and to be able to identify Jews. This is a Jewish hat, and Jews often had to wear, like, I can't see it here, but it was like a little round badge called a ruel. And if you wore that little badge, that indicated, of course, you were Jewish. It was usually yellow. Unfortunately, it made Jews stand out, and so were often subject to ridicule because they looked different. Okay, we're going to talk now about Rabbeinu Gershom, because this is very important. Rabbeinu Gershom really was, we know him as Me'or HaGadol, the light of the exile. Rabbeinu Gershom was born in Metz in France in 960. He became head of the yeshiva in the Rhineland. He was really the first of the rabbis to really establish like a big learning center in Mainz. And people started to flock to this yeshiva from all around the Jewish world. He wrote commentaries on the Talmud, poems, Hebrew language, and once he becomes his head of the yeshiva, he starts to accumulate and teach a whole group of people that will then become rabbis of the next generation. In the year 1000, a delegation of rabbis came together, and we get a whole bunch of these cherem, these bands that we know of as the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom. So that's, I guess, when we think of him today, we think of him being famous for all these bands, but it really distinguishes Ashkenazi Jewry from other Jewry of the time because of these prohibitions. So some of the prohibitions are on polygamy. So that's the one we always hear about now, that Jews, of course, for 1,000 years, it's now past 1,000 years, but still keep to it, Jews were not allowed to take more than one wife. And then, of course, we get another ban then on forcing divorce on a wife, because now you've only got one wife. So a man might then decide, well, he just doesn't like that wife, so he's just going to divorce her. So a wife would have to give consent. A whole bunch of bans on opening letters that you couldn't open. You can't open a letter that's not addressed to you. And also he instituted a whole lot of laws for people that had been forcibly converted to Christianity, because of course at this time there were massive pressure on the Jewish community to convert to Christianity, and some people did under pressure and then wanted to return back. So all in all, there were many cherems, many bans, and that's actually all due to Rabbeinu Gershom, and he really had to make things in line with the Christian society around him, so that Jews didn't look bad, because in the Christian church, celibacy was the highest level. So if you suddenly have a man marrying multiple wives, that really didn't look good in Christian society at all, and it would have made people think even more negatively of Jews. So that was why many of these bans then came into place, to try and make Jews sort of more part of the society and still manage to maintain and strengthen their Judaism. Okay, now, we can't talk about medieval Jewry without talking about Rashi. So Rashi was probably the most important medieval Jewish figure of Ashkenaz. He is the father of Ashkenazi Jewry. And so it's important that we know a bit about Rashi. He was born in 1040. So at the time when Jewish Ashkenaz is really establishing itself very, very strongly in the area. And his name, of course, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. He is the first, or one of the first of the Rishonim. So the group that we know of the Rishonim, the first. Rashi we know as you cannot open a Chumash without seeing Rashi. You can't open a Talmud without seeing Rashi. So really what Rashi did was he took all his student notes and he compiled massive amounts of lots of students' notes, put it all together. He was amazing at compiling things and synthesizing. So he'd take oral law and layer it on top of written law so that you could understand the written law properly. And without Rashi, this would be almost impossible. We almost never learn Chumash without Rashi. Even from primary school, we're learning Chumash with Rashi. And so, Rashi's importance even till this day it can't be, it's huge. It's massive. And Rashi himself starts a whole house of Rashi. So he didn't have any sons, but he had 3 daughters who were very, very learned, and their children then become the Tosfot, then become the house of Rashi, and their commentaries as well, and their writings and their yeshivas then become really established in Ashkenaz and become famous throughout the Jewish world. So Rashi, of course, had a yeshiva in Troy. So even though he himself was born in Troy, in France, he then went to go and learn at Rabbeinu Gershom's yeshiva, even though Rabbeinu Gershom was no longer there. He went to go and learn at his yeshiva in Mainz and in Worms. And then he went back and established his own yeshiva when he was very young. I've read some places say 25, some people say 30. It's hard to imagine in this day and age a 25 or 30-year-old, having that many students and that much influence and having that much learning just already by the time they were 25, that he could establish, the house of Rashi then. So now we're going to have a quick look at, okay, oh yes, you can see that's Rashi's study and Rashi's shul. And that's Rashi's script on top there. I'm going to look now at Rabbeinu Tam. So Rabbeinu Tam is one of Rashi's grandsons. Rashi has many grandsons who became very famous, and they what we know of as the Tosfot. Rabbeinu Tam was probably the most famous, and he was the leader of French Jewry after Rashi. Now, towards the end of Rashi's life, Rashi dies 10 years after the Crusades. So really, Rashi lives in an amazing time in Ashkenaz, but he dies in a time when, just after the first Crusades, when things are absolutely shocking, terrible for the Jewish community in Ashkenaz. Rashi himself is not affected by it, because those areas of France where Rashi lived in Troy, that was not affected by the first Crusade. But of course, the devastation and the death and the atrocities that happened from the first Crusade that really affected the Rhineland, because that was where Rashi had learned, were atrocious. And Rashi really spent those last 10 years trying to piece everything together and put everything together. Rabbeinu Tam now is living in this era of the Crusades. So the Crusades have already happened by the time the first Crusade. There's many Crusades, and we're going to discuss Crusades soon. But Rabbeinu Tam is living and is leader of French Jewry after the first Crusade, and so he's living in a very different era. This is an era where Jews are very confused. They don't know what to do. That they've experienced. It's sort of like living in a post-Holocaust era, just as the Holocaust has happened, and you need very strong Jewish leadership there to piece things together and to hold the community together. And basically, Rabbeinu Tam was one of those sort of figures, whereas Rashi was a very soft, gentle character. Rabbeinu Tam was not. He was much sort of harsher, stronger, and passed laws that were there to keep the community together after the Crusades. You can see two people living in very different eras. Rashi's grandchildren were, whilst often adding to Rashi, were not afraid to argue with Rashi sometimes and disagree with him. And so, when we think of Rabbeinu Tam now, we often think of him with his different tefillin. He had ideas that tefillin should be packed in a different way to Rashi, and so we have a tefillin from Rabbeinu Tam and tefillin from Rashi. But very strong leader at the time. Now we need to talk about the Crusades. Okay, so maybe I'll stop sharing and I can actually you can probably see me a little bit better, and then I'll try and share it again. Can you see me a bit better now that I've stopped sharing my screen? Yeah, and then I'll move this a bit to now, then I can actually everything. All right, now so it's very important to understand the Crusades, because the Crusades changed everything for the Jews of Ashkenaz, and if it wasn't for the Crusades, our history might have been completely different to what we know it is now. So basically, in 1095, the Pope calls Christians together to form a crusade to go and liberate the Holy Land from the infidel being the Muslims. There were Shiite Muslims at that stage in charge of Israel, charge of the Holy Land, and there had been some cases of Christian pilgrims being refused to go to holy sites. And this entire crusade, this entire gathering of people together, starts to develop in 1095 and really has formed by 1096. So now I want you to imagine we're in the Middle Ages, and you've got these bands of roving knights with absolutely nothing to do. They need to fight. That's what they're there for. And so, you know, when there haven't been wars, there are knights just going around making trouble. And so, of course, the nobility and the kings are happy at some stage to get rid of knights and send them to the Holy Land on this big crusade. Whether they thought they'd actually get to the Holy Land or not, they weren't sure if they were going to actually get there. But the first crusade actually lands up in 1099, getting to the Holy Land. Of course, they kill every Jewish, I mean, there weren't many Jews living in Israel at the time, but they kill all of them that are there, and kill, you know, many of the Muslims that are there, and sell the rest into slavery. So that was their goal. But on the way to the Holy Land, they come across, so don't forget, they're coming from England, they're coming from France, they're coming from Germany, and they come across all these little towns along the Rhineland. And they sort of think to themselves, well, why are we going, you know, all the way to the Holy Land to kill the infidel when the infidel is sitting right in front of us? And we might as well just get rid of all non-believers of Christianity whilst we're at it. And so basically at that stage, they destroy on a level that we didn't really see again until maybe the Khmelnytsky massacres and then the Holocaust. Shocking tortures, atrocities on a terrible level of the Crusaders then going through the Rhineland. They start in Speyer, and actually the bishop of Speyer protected the Jews, most of them, managed to get most of them into his castle and get rid of these marauding hordes of people, because not just knights, but they had gathered, the Crusades just gathered, you know, people along the way, anyone that wanted to come on this big crusade to the Holy Land was following, because the Crusades needed, you know, they needed food, they were just a hungry mass. They were tired, they hadn't seen action. So when they got to these Jewish communities, that was, you know, when they put everything that they had been planning for the Holy Land, they just put it all into action then. And they also believed that they would go to heaven, you know, if they killed infidel. And heaven was a very important thing in the Middle Ages. They also believed that they would get indulgences. The church promised them these things called indulgences if they killed the infidel. So they would get, like, you know, a special trip to heaven, or special. It was like you get a mitzvah, special mitzvah if you then killed Jews or if you killed Muslims. And the people are very ignorant. Of course, you know, they just they followed what they thought they were, you know, they thought they were doing the right thing by going to the Holy Land, but of course it went crazy when they came to the Rhineland, and we should never forget the atrocities that were committed in the First Crusade. I said before, Speyer was sort of saved, but then they got to Worms, and the bishop there couldn't do anything. Interestingly, the Jews were often protected by the bishop. But, you know, these masses came and killed. And then when they got to Mainz, they really, like, totally destroyed the community there. And that was where the main yeshiva was, that main yeshiva that Rabbeinu Gershom had established, where Rashi had learned, that was all destroyed. And Jews really had to flee. So there was like, Jews either had flee or flee. You either paid them to leave you alone if you could, or you ran away. But often, you know, in the Crusades, you couldn't pay, and you couldn't run away. So lots of Jews were forcibly converted. Many Jews chose to take their own lives rather than be forcibly converted. And other Jews were murdered. Okay, so for Europe, actually the Crusades, I'll start sharing again a little bit. Oops, can I share the screen? Yes. Here we go. So for Europe, the Crusades were actually not a bad thing. It changed the way people thought about life. They experienced new places. They saw new things. The church had less influence on them, and really because of the Crusades, we then get all sorts of other things establishing, like the Renaissance. But unfortunately, for Jews, the Crusades were atrocious. And we need to talk now about medieval anti-Semitism, because how could something like the Crusades happen if anti-Semitism wasn't there? So medieval anti-Semitism, let me just see if it's in here. It takes many different forms. You know, in the ancient times, there wasn't really anti-Semitism. People didn't necessarily hate Jews. That was sort of a bit more xenophobic. So people didn't like people that were different. And then when the early church starts, it's sort of, you know, there's a lot of this rhetoric to say bad things about Judaism, and in that way put the church to elevate the church by saying bad things about Judaism. So if you say bad things a lot, sometimes words become actions. And so in the Middle Ages, actually always words become actions. You said enough. And in the Middle Ages, really, you have a change in this sort of church rhetoric becoming mass Jewish hatred. And so, you know, the accusations of deicide that have come from the church then and then sort of develops into the general people taking something out of them, begin to hate Jews because they've killed Jesus. The Jew becomes a representation of anything evil, anything bad, and so that's how rhetoric can become, you know, mass murder in Crusades. I spoke to you before about the Jewish clothes that had come along. That's of course a form of anti-Semitism coming out of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Blood libels are very important to discuss because they form a really important part of medieval life. Unfortunately, blood libels, basically, Jews were accused of killing Christian children and using them for their blood, and they were accused of using the blood for matzah. They were accused of using the blood as an aphrodisiac, or all sorts of things, terrible things that are unimaginable. Jews were accused of using Christian blood. So unfortunately, if a Christian child was killed, and people didn't know who the murderer was, or even if they did, very often Jewish communities were blamed for that. And once there was a blood libel, there was always mob violence afterwards, almost always mob violence following a blood libel, and very often an expulsion following blood libel. The desecration of the host was even more sort of interesting. Jews were accused of taking the wafer that's used in communion and somehow stabbing it or kidnapping it, and in that way it was sort of an embodiment of doing a deicide. And when Jews were accused of desecrating the host, again, mob violence almost always followed. So if someone was angry with the Jew or owed money to a Jew, or needed something that they didn't get from a Jew, then they would just say that Jewish community or those people had desecrated the host. And then after then, you know, Jews would get expelled or mob violence would follow. Jews were often demonized, were often dehumanized. There's the whole concept of the Judensau, which I actually didn't put a picture of the Judensau. It's actually so horrible. I don't know who would be watching this, if there would be young children watching, but you can look it up. the Yudin-Sao is a pig, and Jews were often shown to be doing all sorts of interesting things with the pig. And that was a form of demonization. It's usually a picture of a devil when you see a picture of a Yudin-Sao as well. And so all of this sort of lands up with anti-Semitism building, mob violence, and expulsions. And you'll see that Jews were expelled from many, many places. You know, when you think about expulsions, you're thinking about expulsion from Spain. But expulsion from Spain was terrible, for sure, shocking in 1492. But Jews were actually expelled from many places in Ashkenaz too. And that was one of the problems with the expulsion from Spain, was that there weren't a lot of places that Jews could go once they had been expelled from Spain. So I'm going to show you hopefully a map here of the expulsions. And I mean, if I know this is recorded, if you get to look at this map properly afterwards, you'll see that really Jews were expelled from many, many, many areas and many times from the area. So if you look at France, you know, 1182, then 1306, then 1321, then 1394. So you can see they're expelled each time, but then they are recalled. And they're usually recalled because money is needed again, money lending is needed again. Commerce goes to pieces when the Jews disappear, and so they get them back. Or you get a new king coming in, and he decides he actually wants Jews, so he'll bring them back. And then, you know, his son comes along and doesn't want them, so he'll get rid of them. Or as soon as the debt gets too much, then they expel Jews. So France was sort of devoid of Jews for quite some time. You can see, you know, Spain and Portugal. We know about England, of course, expelled in 1290, and really didn't come back until 1652. So that a long time Jews were not in England. Expelled from England before any of these other places. We often don't talk about the expulsion from England, but it was huge. Germany wasn't one big country. Germany was many different principalities. So Jews would be expelled from, you know, from one place, and then they could just move to another place. So very often there were Jews remaining in Germany over this whole period, even though they weren't, you know, they might have been expelled from one city, but then they'd move to another city in Germany. So Jews tending to stay in Germany, but just move around Germany. Jews, you can see Hungary, Rome, Papal States, Naples, Sicily, and then you get this movement of Jews going all the way east, because they literally don't have too many places to go, and invitations to the east. And next week we're going to talk in detail about that whole movement east. And how Jews landed in Poland and Lithuania. But you can see the expulsions here, and you can see it happened on a large scale. It was not an uncommon thing for Jews to be expelled, and so Jews became very good at moving around from place to place. Okay, now plagues. Okay, so our generation knows lots about plagues, and you know, had I been talking about this topic last year, no one would have known really had a deep experience about what it was like to live during a plague. But all of us now, whichever country we're in, have been very exposed to living during the time of a pandemic. And basically, that was what the bubonic plague was. It was a pandemic. So the Black Death, which is the bubonic plague, starts in 1347, and it spreads. We know, we can see how quickly it spread in 2020. But in the Middle Ages, things are obviously going to spread slow. You don't have airplanes taking people from one place to the next. But you know, you've got ships, and with ships you've got rats, and with rats you've got fleas. And so they are carrying, you know, the vectors carrying the plague. But unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, people were very superstitious, and they didn't understand medicine, and they didn't understand science. And you can see even now in 2020 with COVID, it takes us a long time to actually figure out what's causing the virus, how to cure the virus, how to fix the virus. But we're not dealing with you know, a superstitious medieval population, hopefully. So here, you know, they really didn't know what was causing all the sickness. Jews, of course, died too. Okay, so we know that 20 million people in Europe died from the plague, from the bubonic plague. That's a third of Europe's population. It's massive, and it was a terrible death. It was not just simply die. It was an awful death. But people didn't know what caused it, and of course, you've got a scapegoat. It's going to be Jews, and so Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and doing magic and causing the bubonic plague. In general, Jews might not have had it as badly because of Jewish ritual laws that sort of kept things a little bit cleaner at the time. We're living in a very, a time of no sanitation. I mean, if you think here, people are still getting COVID, but they're sanitizing all the time, washing everything and cleaning everything. But this is not a time when people even knew that they had to even bath themselves. So you're not talking about like washing hands all the time. And Jews tended to, you have to wash before you have bread. You have to wash before you have food. Separate things. The person dies, they must be buried very quickly. It wasn't the same for the Christian population. If they died, they could take a long time before they were buried. And so there was, of course, more spreading of the disease. So when they looked at communities and they saw less Jews were dying of it, but Jews, of course, were dying of it. They definitely died of the bubonic plague, but maybe less. So maybe that allowed them to think maybe the Jews were causing it. But for sure, the Jews were not the cause of the bubonic plague. And after the bubonic plague, you just get a whole bunch of pogroms that follow. Just about in every country where the bubonic plague is, Jews were accused. And certainly in Germany, Germany again got mob violence for a while. And Jews were forced to move from town to town to town to town to try and escape this terrible violence that then ensued after the bubonic plague. I've included this picture in it because now we sort of understand what it's like wearing a mask. These are kind of interesting medieval masks. Yeah, I always used to look at this type of picture when I was a kid and think I was like really intrigued by that sort of beak type mask. But there was a doctor in those days. So you can see he's got all his PPE on, not his hands, unfortunately, but he's very well protected. And this sort of beak mask had herbs inside it, so to try and stop ill smelling or foul smelling things that were present, and to try and keep doctors safe, because of course healthcare workers even in those days were at the most risk. But the bubonic plague did stop. You can see there, it stops in 1352 when everyone that was going to die from it died. It does come back multiple times actually throughout the next sort of 500 years. And actually there was recently a case of bubonic plague actually in Mongolia. But yeah, it did come back a number of times. But yeah, it leads to a whole bunch of expulsions from different areas and pogroms. So Jews leave, they have to leave. And so where do Jews move? This is sort of a map of showing you Jews coming out of the lands of Ashkenaz, the traditional lands of Ashkenaz, of Germany and France, and moving east. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, how they moved, why they moved, and where they went. You can see, Lithuania is up on top there. This area over here is Poland. And so next week when we discuss the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and hopefully I'll try and go into a little bit more detail about Lithuania than I did in my talks here, because I think a lot of the population comes from Lithuania. Yeah, I'll try and talk more in detail about that next week. And yeah, so Jews pretty much in the lands of Ashkenaz managed to keep Judaism. They were strong. They were strong in keeping Judaism. Very few Jews in Ashkenaz converted, whereas you have a completely different sort of picture happening in Spain. We've got about a third of the population converting under duress, but in Ashkenaz, almost nobody converting. And when they did convert, they often very quickly came back. They chose death before they chose conversion. And because of this vehement anti-Semitism that Ashkenazi Jews had to live with, it became part of their life. They became very inward focused. So you focused on the community. You didn't focus as much on what was happening around, on secular learning, not like what we see from Spain. Spain was very involved in philosophy and in secular learning. The Ashkenazi Jewish community gets progressively more inward focused to protect themselves and to keep themselves safe Jewishly and physically. Yeah, so that's my talk for tonight. If any of you, I have no idea what the time is. I've usually got my phone right next to me, and so stop sharing. I've usually got my phone right next to me, and so I know what it is. And I sort of monitor it because
perfect. So perfect for time. Perfect for time. We're just under an hour. Just before we conclude, and I thank you. I just wanted a shout out to Craig Nossel, who I know is on this call and has been living, as we know, in Melbourne now for a few months. And thank God he's found himself a good optometrist. So Craig, I'm glad that you're able to connect tonight, your time. It's almost midday over here, almost 12 o'clock. But Bev, thank you so much for such an enlightening, fascinating talk. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone that's joined today, that we so look forward to next week's talk. Thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure.
I see a lot of old Emmarentia friends there. Stanley, it's Lily McCarthy.
It's so nice to be able to.
And now we were members of Emmarentia Shul forever. All our kids got married there.
So this is a wonderful chance to reconnect.
The name is McCarthy. Good friend of Wendy Ross.
Lovely to see you, Lily.
Yeah, you too, Stan. And Aubrey Gamzu. Where are you, Aubrey?
He's hiding.
Disappeared.
Just on that note, I just want to again thank Bev.
All my friends.
I'm very happy, guys. You can stay on and chat, but I know that it's late Melbourne time. I don't want to keep Bev much longer. I know she's got a family and she's so graciously given of her time. So by all means, you're welcome to stay on this call and chat. Please do. But let me excuse Bev. And once again, Bev, thank you so much. And we so look forward to next week.
Absolute pleasure. And if you have any questions, please do ask me. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone's got any questions. Now, you don't need to record it. If you want, you can stop the recording. But if you do have questions,